Afternoon, everyone. Thanks to those of you that have already joined us. We'll get started very soon, but just while we're waiting for the kind of the first minute or so, it would be great for as many of you as possible to join us on Slido. This will be our kind of main interaction tool, which you can join using this code here or the QR on the screen. Just to say, when using Slido, don't kind of use any personal information about you or your students, because although it's completely anonymous, your answers will appear on the screen. So just be mindful of that. And also just that our workshop is recorded today. So you will be getting the recording as well as the slides as well. But just to say that anything you put on Slido will be in that recording. But as I said, it would be great to get as many of you joining as possible. So if you can do that while we're just waiting, just for the next minute or so before we start the presentation. I think another person's just joined us, so if you could just join us at slido.com using that code or the QR code before we kind of get started. Great, just aware of time. So what I will do is just go back to the beginning, just introduce the workshop today. So as hopefully all of you are aware of, we're going to be talking about trauma in the light of people seeking refuge. And we're both from the Psychology in Schools team, which is part of Norfolk and Suffolk NHS Foundation Trust, which is the local mental health service in Norfolk and Suffolk. And we'll be saying a little bit more about why we're doing this workshop and other things our team does. But just to start with, to introduce ourselves, my name's Kelsey Odgers, and I'm a clinical psychologist working in the Psychology in Schools team. And I'll just hand over to my colleague.
Hi, I'm Linda Brindle. I'm a senior psychotherapist also working in the team.
Okay, so I don't think anyone else has joined us since we talked a bit about Slido, so hopefully we'll get as many of you on Slido as possible. It definitely makes the session more interactive, and it's useful to get a sense of where you're coming from today. So with that said, for those of you that are on Slido, it'd be great just to get a sense of what your job role is. See two people are typing, which is fantastic. So again, as I said, it's completely anonymous. It'd be great to get as many of you as possible joining us. Yeah, so pastoral, so someone who works in pastoral in the school, and someone else who's a lecturer in business and a trainer in apprenticeships. Okay, from maybe a slightly different area to schools, but you know, still some relevant stuff hopefully that we'll talk through. Safety, health and wellbeing advisor in Suffolk schools. Great. And I guess this workshop was specifically for Suffolk and Norfolk areas. It's good to get a sense of that as well. You can see one other person's typing. Working in schools to contact with EAL students. Brilliant. So that hopefully today lots of what we're talking about will be relevant for that as well. Perfect. Okay, so I'm just going to move on. So what age children or young people do you work with? Again, it'd just be good to get a sense. There might be kind of a broad range that you're covering, just so we can maybe think about that as we go through the presentation today. Wow, okay, so one person's saying sort of all these age ranges, it's fairly broad. We really will keep that in mind as we go through today. Brilliant, great to see lots of you joining us at Slido there. It's really, really useful. So thank you. And then finally, it'd be good to get a sense of if you have contact with refugee children. It may be that, yeah, some of you have already had contact, you know, it's part of your roles. It may be that you're a host, and it might be that not yet, but you're sort of expecting to in kind of the coming weeks, for example. So it'd be good to get a sense of that as well. Okay, so again, a bit of a broad range of experiences here. So some people have had contact, some are expecting to, but haven't yet, and others not at the present moment. And I think as we go through, it'd be great. There's several Slidos, as you'll see, as we go through the presentation today, to really hear about some of your experiences of that contact you've had, or things that you might have read or other colleagues have said to you. It'd be useful just to share. And if we can get as many of you as possible, that would be fantastic. Okay, so as we've already said, today we're going to be talking about trauma in the light of people seeking refuge. And we thought it would be useful just to start really by giving a bit of an overview of why we're kind of doing this session today, kind of in the context of the work that our team does, as well as just a couple of caveats, but also thinking about kind of yourselves and looking after yourselves through such a workshop. So I guess as a team, we've been offering PD Day workshops on a range of wellbeing and mental health topics. We also offer them to parents and caregivers as well, so useful for you to be aware of, as we'll signpost to at the end. And through previous workshops that we've delivered to hosts of kind of refugee families, and our links with the Ukrainian support hubs in both Norfolk and Suffolk, a session specifically for school staff, those kind of working into school, was requested to give some more information about trauma and how trauma can present in young people. And also how you as school staff, who are in an incredibly valuable position to kind of support these young people, can support the well-being of young people who are seeking refuge and kind of coming into school. So the focus of today is essentially that. So it's been specifically developed with you in mind, with you as school staff in mind, and thinking about trauma and what you can kind of do within your school to kind of create that sense of psychological and physical safety as well. And just a couple of caveats that we wanted to mention before we kind of get started into the content. So that just to say, most of our examples are from the Ukrainian crisis, as that's kind of what's prompted us to do this workshop. And as we've said, comes from the links that we've got with those hosts and community hubs. But of course, we're aware that refugees have been coming to this country for many years, and your school may have been supporting them for some time. So we're just really highlighting that from the beginning, just to make you aware. And another caveat is that we are not experts in war-related trauma, but are clinicians who have worked with trauma in young people and have experience and training around trauma and mental health. So really, this session is drawing on our experience of that, and also with child development and other things as well around creating psychological safety. So this really is an introductory session to some of those key issues, really. And we hope that by the end, you'll leave feeling reassured in what you might already be doing if you're already supporting some of these young people, but also to give you some more ideas perhaps as we go through. So please, as I said, the session's being recorded, so you'll get all of that and you'll get the slides. So please just jot down any ideas that maybe you want to think more about, or that you want to speak to colleagues or other people in your school about, to really come back to it and focus more on. And I guess finally, trauma is an emotive topic for anyone. And sometimes if we really connect with other people's traumatic experiences, it can be quite distressing for us as well. And I guess we wanted to just acknowledge that talking about these topics, because we all have individual different experiences, can be quite difficult. So of course, within this session, if you need to take a break or get up and have a walk around, or actually just stop today and come back to the recording and slides at another time, then absolutely do that. So really just do whatever feels most comfortable for you. Okay, so with all of that said, we're going to be, as I've said, giving a kind of brief introduction to understanding trauma and trauma in young people specifically, and really what you can do within that educational setting, support psychological safety and the development of your students as well. We're going to be sharing kind of more resources at the end about things you can signpost young people and their families to, and information about how to access more help if you are concerned about a young person. But also we are going to be thinking about you as school staff as well in supporting these students, and really the great importance of looking after yourself, which really in this context cannot be underestimated. So as we've said, jot down any ideas or thoughts that you really want to come back to, and would really encourage that as we go. So let's kind of move on to the main content, and we're going to be thinking firstly about how it's feeling for you at the moment to really connect with those feelings. So how do you feel when you think about supporting a young person who's seeking refuge in your kind of educational setting? And I guess, just holding in mind that some of you have had those experiences, so what kind of feelings come up for you, but also for some of you that may be preempting that or thinking about that, what kind of emotions kind of come up for you. It can be anything at all. And I guess, there might be several different emotions. We often experience a mix of emotions with these kinds of things. So please just put several different ones if you're experiencing different things that come up for you. There's someone saying it, empathy. Yeah. So really kind of thinking about those young people's and their family situation and kind of what they're going through and putting yourselves in their position perhaps as well. Sadness and loss, yes, those kind of really painful emotions, perhaps feeling quite sad for them and at a bit of a loss perhaps, or recognizing the loss that they've had. Lots of different feelings around loss. Frustration, Ari, lack of Ukrainian, my lack of Ukrainian. I'm not sure if that was meant to be a longer sentence. Maybe not.
I think that might be lack of Ukrainian language skills.
Yes, that makes sense. Thanks, Linda. Thank you. Yes. So actually feeling perhaps a bit frustrated with yourself and not always having the language that they're using and things like that. That's the thing. That's one actually that lots of host families I've spoken to have talked a lot about as well. Concerned about understanding their needs. Yeah, so kind of feeling a little bit at loss or worries about not fully understanding what their needs might be, and some worries about that. And I guess linked to that, this other comment here about out of depth. Yeah, so just feeling completely at that loss, unsure about where to go and how to kind of help. But I guess with all of that said, there seems like a real sense of really wanting to help, but just not always knowing how to. And I think it's really important that we kind of acknowledge how it's feeling for you as kind of staff in supporting these young people here, because it is, whilst it can be really rewarding, it can be a really difficult thing to do, especially when we don't feel we have the skills or knowledge, to be able to support them in the way that we'd like to be able to. So as we've said, we'll be thinking more about your kind of feelings and experiences as we go through today. So please just kind of hold on to that and really that shared experience between you all, because there's a lot of overlap there between what you've kind of reported. So thank you for sharing those. And as we've said, hopefully today, as we kind of go through the first kind of half of the slides, as we've said, we'll be thinking more about trauma and giving you kind of that information that you might need, as well as then in the second half, thinking about practical things you can do in your kind of environments. And hopefully that will go some way in supporting you to feel kind of more equipped and more able to support in the way that you'd like to be able to. Okay, so we can see here we're going to be focusing firstly around kind of normal reactions that children may experience after a frightening event. And we're going to be talking much more about this throughout the presentation today. And I guess what's firstly important to say that as school staff, you don't need to necessarily know what's happened to your child in order to support them, but it can be really helpful to know about some of these really common symptoms of trauma, just to really be able to keep an eye on them, as these young people come into school. So you can see on the slide here some common reactions that children may experience after a traumatic or a frightening event, as really their brains and their bodies are trying to make sense of what's happened. And a lot of this work has come from a brilliant psychologist in the UK called David Trickey, who's done some great work around supporting young people with trauma. So I wonder if you could just take a moment just to look at this slide and just think about what you might be noticing if you're already supporting these young people, what things you might be noticing in them. Are you seeing any of these reactions or things that you may see in other students, for example, who have experienced trauma? Just have a bit of a chance, just have a read through some of those. Just think about how they might relate to some of the experiences you've had with young people. And I guess what it's important for us to hold in mind is not only that these are normal reactions, but also to be mindful of individual differences, which I know is kind of teaching staff you'll be fully aware of. And the same applies to normal reactions after experiencing trauma, because every child, of course, will be different in what they experience, but also how they experience them, and also what triggers them as well, which we will be talking a lot more about. So of course, it's, as we've said, it's quite normal to be upset, experience big emotions, even after a while, after experiencing a traumatic event. And there'll be big feelings that often come up with it, which we'll talk more about. So in the classroom, for example, you might find that a child seems detached or is struggling to stay focused, or trying to kind of hide in full view. And we know that memories of past difficult experience bring with them all the fear and distress that came with the original event. And these can be triggered by several things, such as sounds, smells. It can be internal things such as sensations, and other situations as well. So I guess it's just an important note here to just be mindful and compassionately curious about those potential triggers, as again, they will be different for different young people. So example, it might just be really thinking about your school environment. So for example, certain topics in lessons might be triggering. So learning about guns, for example, or in history lessons. It might be those loud noises that you may get in, say, music, or acting things out in drama. But also thinking a bit more broadly than that in the kind of school environment. So planes going past, or other loud noises such as the bell. And we're going to just be thinking later on with you, and Linda's going to talk about this more, about how you might manage and just be kind of compassionately curious about those triggers in your own environment, own school environment. And we know that for young people, but also for those supporting those young people, such as yourselves and also parents and carers, that if you're helped to kind of understand when these reactions are kind of normal and understandable, that actually the worry, anxiety and distress about them can be decreased, which is why we're kind of really sort of honing in on this as a first point. And we know that, just to say, normal reactions to trauma can impact on every aspect of a person, such as how they feel. So those big emotions, anger, fear, frustration, they might be more easily upset, or have sort of rapid change in moods, or have physical complaints as well. So I guess it's just holding in mind that all different types of emotions can come up for different people, and they're absolutely normal. Trauma can also impact how a young person thinks. So as a mind tries to make sense of what's happened, we know that nightmares can occur, or memories and pictures can pop into their mind, which can make it really difficult for a young person to concentrate as well. So just holding that in mind, particularly in a classroom environment. And finally, it can impact how young people act and react. So we know that it can influence what they choose to do or not to do. There can be an avoidance of talking or thinking about trauma, or sort of being near reminders of that event. So we know that it's really common for children to perhaps play or draw about the event. They might also be clingier or have changes in sleep and toileting as well. But it's just really, the emphasis here is to say that these are all normal reactions. And again, if we can hold on to that, and we can be that voice kind of for the young people, but their families, that can lower the distress around them. So with all of that said, we're going to be thinking about what is trauma next. So it's a term I think that's used quite a lot. And I think it's useful when we're thinking about how we can support young people who may have experienced trauma to think about what we mean by it. So going through something very stressful, frightening, or distressing is sometimes called trauma. And when we talk about emotional or psychological trauma, we are thinking about situations or events that we find traumatic, or how we're impacted by such events. So we know that trauma can be different things. It can be a one-off or ongoing events. It can be a result of being directly harmed yourself, or witnessing another person being harmed. But it can also be living in a traumatic environment, or being affected by trauma in family or the community. And it's also important to know that there are many different types of trauma. So of course, today we'll be focusing on the trauma that many Ukrainian refugees have faced around the current war situation, as well as refugee trauma, which we'll talk more about in a second. But we also need to be mindful that the young people that we're supporting may have experienced previous trauma separate from the war situation as well. So again, just holding in mind what previous experiences those young people joining your kind of environments may have already experienced is. So we know that Ukrainian refugees, or indeed any kind of refugees, have likely experienced and are continuing to experience trauma based on the things they've witnessed or been involved with, but also the experience of being displaced by war itself is very traumatic, as it involves multiple losses. So I won't cover all of them, but if we think about the loss of home, social status, loved ones, pets, possessions, and all of the rest, they're going through an awful lot. And therefore, given this, the Charity Commission states that all refugees should be considered vulnerable. So the power dynamic means that they're vulnerable to exploitation, whether that's voluntary or not, or intentional or not. And therefore, it's important to be especially attentive to safeguarding these vulnerable children. So we'll be really holding this in mind throughout the rest of the presentation today. So we wanted to touch on brain development, kind of child development and trauma as part of the initial information giving around trauma, because I think this is really key when we think about supporting young people, particularly in the education environment. So the left-hand image you can see there, so the upside down pyramid, that shows typical development. So we know that most babies don't need to worry so much about survival because their caregivers are doing it for them. They're making sure they're fed, they're making sure they're safe, and their needs are met. So over time and with support from that caregiver, they can learn to regulate their emotions. That's through a process of that co-regulation and their caregiver being really attuned to what they're kind of experiencing and helping them to learn that skill over time. They then move on, and I know lots of you are aware of this, I'm sure, to more ecocentric behaviour. So that's thinking only of themselves, which is a really normal thing for those younger ones. And then finally, kind of moving towards more pro-social behaviours, so considering kind of the needs, thoughts and wants of other people. And then finally, they move on to the biggest part of the triangle. So with all those other things in place, as we've just talked about, there's room for that cognitive development. And that's those skills to kind of think logically, to be rational, to problem solve, and to manage impulses. So that's kind of your typical developmental picture. But what we know is that for those who have experienced trauma in their early years, they've had to focus much more on survival, which brings us on to the right-hand image there, the kind of the pyramid there. And actually, we know that they, as we've said, have to focus so much more on survival. So if you think about a child in a war situation, they have to be thinking about, will I eat? Will I be hurt? Will my family be hurt? And those needs can't be met in the same way. So they'll be stuck in the primitive part of their brain where the focus is all on to keep them alive. So all of their energy may be used up on that survival because that's the key thing we need. So there'll be less opportunity for that social, emotional development, and then limited capacity for kind of the luxury of developing those higher level cognitive functioning skills. So they may not be able to regulate their emotions so well. They won't necessarily have the same skills in problem solving and kind of managing those impulses that perhaps those young people who haven't had those experiences will be able to do. And a really nice resource from the Beacon House, which is a resource will be shared at the end, explains that the problem for traumatized children is that even once they transition into a safe environment, which may be for these young people, with their host families in the UK, actually that even once they've done that, the survival responses do not turn off. And I guess what we also know for lots of these families, they're still hearing lots of messages through the media, maybe from others at school, but also for loved ones who may still be in their home countries. So actually for them, that threat still hasn't ended. So the children may continually be in that survival mode, as we've said, and even those small everyday things might signal life or death danger. And again, these will be different for different people because they're still in that survival part of their brain. And just finally to say, Professor van der Kolk suggests that if a young person doesn't feel safe for an ongoing sort of period of time, their threat system remains active. So they're kind of always ready to respond to real or perceived danger. And it doesn't have, the brain doesn't have the capacity then, as we said, for those other skills and to learn those other skills. And I guess what we kind of wanted to do here was just to say that it's important to be aware of this and be mindful of this, but that we can help our young people, as we're going to go on to think about, in sort of helping them to feel physically and psychologically safe as well. So we wanted to now sort of highlight some of the kind of good news aspects as well, and sort of some of that really important research that will kind of take us through the rest of the workshop today. So whilst we know that all of the refugee students may have been exposed to traumatic experiences, we know that the impact of those experiences will be different for all of them. So the first bit of good news, as this kind of pie chart here really illustrates, is that research shows only a small proportion of people who have experienced traumatic events go on to needing help in order to process those memories. So we know that when those traumatic memories aren't processed, young people struggle to then live in the present moment. Those memories can get stuck, and they can therefore become more inhibited and struggle to kind of engage in the life they'd like to. So you can see there the red bit of the pie chart shows us what percentage of people kind of need to go on to have an intervention, and that there are evidence-based interventions available for the NHS when this is needed. And towards the end of the session, we'll be thinking about if you feel young people may need some more support. But I guess the first bit of good news, as we've said, that the rest of this pie chart shows, is that most experiences, including the overwhelming ones, are processed naturally over time. And that happens through normal processes such as sleep, but also through things such as talking, writing, drawing, or acting out something difficult. And we know that the brain processes trauma layer by layer, sort of over time, and with opportunity and when it's ready as well. And I guess it's important to say that this is the same with any trauma, whether that be kind of a bereavement, an accident, or in a war situation. So just please hold on to that firstly. And the second bit of good news, that research tells us kind of what helps recovery after a traumatic event, is that we can all do things to help support recovery and processing of those traumatic memories after that kind of event. And I guess, we didn't think anything on here would be too surprising, but just really important to highlight, to show, how important and what a brilliant role that you kind of can serve in schools for these young people. So firstly, research tells us that children develop in an environment of relationships that are supportive, and we know that they can buffer the response to toxic stress. So we know that safe, stable, trusting, nurturing relationships and environments are associated with reduced markers of toxic stress, as well as kind of improved outcomes in terms of physical and mental health following a traumatic event. So in other words, there are other very influential experiences which can buffer the effects of early trauma and stress. So kind of you being reliable, trusting, available adults can be really important in buffering those some of those difficult experiences. We also know that a child's adaptive, emotional, and cognitive development is promoted by a sensitive, nurturing caregiver who's emotionally available and kind of attuned to the young person's needs. So I guess that tells us the importance of that kind of parental support when we're thinking about these young people. Just finally as well, there's been a systematic review by someone called Faisal back in 2011, looking at the mental health of young people who are displaced from a range of countries into high-income countries. And they found that stable settlement and social support in host countries can have a positive effect on child's psychological functioning. And that in particular, the importance of peer relationships, because they can have the biggest impact on instilling a positive sense of belonging. And again, schools are in an incredibly valuable position to think about the development of peer relationships for those young people. And I guess finally, a range of studies over the past decade who have studied some of those children who have been sort of forcibly displaced by war have highlighted the significant impact that parental stress has on child development. So as we said, finding the right kind of parental support is important here. So this evidence can really help guide us to think about what you can do within a school environment to support these young people seeking refuge, which we'll be talking about for the second half of the presentation. So just before I hand over to Linda to think about those things, we wanted to introduce you to a model from someone called Maslow. So this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Some of you may be aware of it already. And this is his theory on human motivation. And Maslow kind of proposed that it's only when our most basic physical needs, such as food, sleep, water, health, that you can see there at the bottom, are met, are we then able to focus on our need for safety, again, both physical and psychological. And it's only then once those safety needs are met that we're able to then move up to different parts of the triangle, as you can see there, thinking about our kind of social, emotional needs, and then finally those higher level needs at the top. So we recognise that every individual will be in a different place, and that the impact of their experiences over the past few months will of course influence sort of where they are on this pyramid. But we would guess that for the majority of these young people and their families, that they're currently at the bottom end of this pyramid around their basic needs. So we're going to be thinking about how we can support young people to get those needs met, to begin to move up that pyramid. So just before I hand over to Linda, I just want to pose some questions to you. They don't need to be answered, but just maybe to start thinking about. So just have a pause. And I wonder where your students are on the pyramid right now. How long have they been at that stage? And where have they been over the past few months? We're thinking about those of you who are already supporting these young people, but those of you that aren't, thinking about where you think those young people might be. I wonder how able they are just now to think about those higher needs, and then all they've been able or having to focus on is their need to survive, really, to have food, shelter, and be away from danger. And really how long it will be until they feel really safe. Some of them might be there now, but others might not be. And some people may have to stay focused on their basic needs for longer and need more time to feel secure in those stages. So really just hold this in mind, perhaps when they first come to school and their journey throughout as well, because we know, as we've said, each individual adult and child will be different. So I'm going to hand over to Linda now, who's going to be thinking much more about sort of how you can support these young people in this school environment, and really holding in mind this Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So I'll hand over to Linda now.
Thanks, Kelsey. And I guess in this second half, we're very much thinking about what can you do in school, bearing in mind, as Kelsey said, the hierarchy of needs that we can see in front of us, and also bearing in mind that key research that was discussed in the previous slide as well. So we're going to be moving forward, and I think Kelsey's probably going to be moving the slide forward when she's able to, but to be thinking about what can you do in school. So we'll be thinking a little bit about these elements, as you can see on the slide in front of you, a bit more about safety and belonging, the importance of emotional containment, and actually when you need more help, how do you get access to that, what's available? And finally, as Kelsey mentioned at the start, the importance of also bearing in mind the key role that you have in looking after yourselves so that you're in a position to be able to support others. So let's move swiftly on. There's lots to cover within this time. So Kelsey's given us really a little bit of a sense of the impact of trauma on young people who have had to seek refuge away from their country that they have fled from, and thinking about what can you do in school. Firstly, we've been thinking a bit about the value of providing a safe and predictable environment, and we saw that in terms of what's needed on the level of needs, and that very low stage in Maslow's hierarchy, just after the very basic physical needs comes that sense of needing to feel safe. So what we know is that frightening experiences often makes people unsure of what's coming. Everyone, all of us, of course, feel safer when we know what to expect. And that's why routines and predictability are important, but especially important for any child who's feeling vulnerable. And of course, schools can be great places for this because they're big systems that require routine and organisation in order to function. But it's important to know that there are extra reasons why this is helpful for this particular vulnerable group, because actually knowing what's happening when can give a real different sense of feeling safe and secure, having a sense of what to expect. As Kelsey said, being given information that can help us to understand what's going on, and that can reduce anxiety levels. And we'll be talking a little bit more about that in a moment. So trying to encourage clear communication routes. And I realise this is tricky, as somebody really clearly highlighted with this language barrier that we'll often see. Although we know children can be quick to pick up new language, that needs to be at a time that they're ready to do that. And so within the meantime, it can be really tricky with communication. And yet we know that communication is really important to help both the young people themselves and their parents to feel contained with having their children in the school environment. And I guess consistency is not just about how rules are implemented, even though that's key. And of course, when children are in large educational settings, that can become harder just to provide that regular consistency about basic things like rules. But we know that consistency is so important for trust. If we do not do what we say we're going to do, then automatically any trust that's been built up may start to fracture, because in a child's mind, we can't necessarily believe that that will happen if it hasn't happened for some reason in the past, however unexpected it was that you weren't able to follow through on something that you'd said. So as adults, we need to be really mindful of how we respond with these particular young people. And also, as I mentioned, that we can stay regulated ourselves. So unpredictable behaviour from others, sudden shouting, inconsistent reactions, these are the things that may trigger those pupils' threat systems, which are already heightened from their past difficult experience they've had. So we'll leave them more on edge for longer. So we'd expect to see with these children a greater sensitivity to react more quickly when things are difficult. And as Kelsey said, that's why it's so important to try and make sense and understand and get to know what are those difficult things for the young people in your school and in your care. And I guess being mindful of the tone of voice that you use, trying to always use a calm tone will be helpful. We know that giving information in advance always can reduce anxiety. And so you'll know with your knowledge around transitions, the amount of work that goes into helping young people in year 6, for example, manage and be prepared for moving perhaps to another school at year 7 in the same way, even transitions between year groups, opportunities to meet people in advance. How much more important is this for this group of young people who've come from a very different culture, different environment, a different education system? So taking time and opportunity to give information about events and consider what expectations there may be is really important. I realise you can't do that about everything. We can't second guess all the different expectations, but I guess it would be important to recognise that there may be different interpretations. So read the literature that you're sending out, holding in mind how might somebody from a very different culture perceive this. And we know that host families, which is obviously relevant for the Ukrainian refugees, have often had a key role in helping with supporting and giving information and helping understanding of processes. But I guess it can be overwhelming for them too. So what school can do to help with that is really, it can really make a difference. And an example that I'll give that's a host family shared with us was that there was a nice letter about an activity day going out of school in the summer term, last term, that was sent home. But actually for a refugee family, the parent found that a real challenge to think about their child out of the school environment. And I guess for them, the challenge was that they maybe had spent months trying to keep their child safe, fleeing from a war zone, bringing their child to this country, and then having to trust in a host family to keep them safe and secure, somebody that they didn't know, perhaps from Adam in most cases, and actually feel that they can let down their defenses a little to allow that child to be living in that home environment. And then another big step of then actually having to allow their child to go along to school. And we know that can take time for some families to feel ready for that step of releasing their child into another's care. But then to then be faced with something which people are describing as a lovely activity day, but actually a chance for somebody else they don't know, perhaps from the school, escorting their child outside of the safety of the school gates, could feel like one step too far. And I guess that's just an example for us to really hold in mind some of the challenges for these families. And so we can't, as I said, second guess them all, but just be aware of different interpretations. So we also hear, there's very different examples, and every family is different, that some of the families' parents have had limited understanding around health issues. So then they might panic more quickly about a health difficulty that we would feel very comfortable and confident to manage at home, or just with some support from a GP or pharmacist. And there's been more panic there. So just be mindful of different education systems, different knowledge and understanding, different public health systems can really create very different ideas and interpretations around things. So I guess what we're saying is there's lots of differences, and it's a tricky road to navigate, but being able to do what you can to provide that safe, predictable environment we know is key. And you'll know the importance of a safe space. We all need a safe space sometimes when we are feeling emotionally fragile, or we just need a break from others. And I wonder what your safe place is and how you do things to help to sort of down-regulate or manage your emotions and feel more relaxed. I wonder how you manage that. And I guess what we need to think of, we know that space in schools has become more tricky since the pandemic, and it's often at a premium, but we know that finding a dedicated space that will work for that child to feel that if they need to have a space and a breakaway, then even if it's a special cushion or a beanbag in the corner, or a space in the garden on a dry day, then that might be really key to help that child just feel that there's a place that's for them, that they can go if they need to just have a bit of space and manage. And that in itself can provide a real key bit around safety. Okay, so what does safety look like? Well, it can look very different in different situations. So we just put some ideas which you can just have a read while I'm talking on the screen, of maybe some ideas about what to do before a child arrives in school. So I've talked already about sort of differences in education. We know that, for example, in Ukraine, children's experience of school, certainly primary school, is very different. I think they start school later. I think there's perhaps more rest times and less sort of focused learning there in those earlier years, perhaps more like other sort of European countries that sort of get started with things later. So there will be differences there, and so a child may well need a lot of support around a part-time timetable for much longer than you would do with other children. We know that these children who have been in very stressful situations will find a change to such a different culture and environment. They're likely to find that difficult initially and at least exhausting. So they may need those more downtimes than other children starting school. But one of the key things that we know might be really important as you think with transition as well, familiarising themselves, the families familiarising themselves with the school layout, so they've got a sense of where their child will be, the child seeing things in the playground, how that works, the school day, a timetable. Obviously, there's obvious things like signage around and things that are really helpful to share. Might be something to do with giving information about what is assembly, what is covered in science lessons. What do you do when you get an email from school that says a child has a bump on the head? Are you actually meant to respond and react and panic, or actually is it just the school's processes that they will have contacted you if there was something more significant that you need to respond to? And so I guess it's thinking about ways in which you can support before a child arrives, the family to understand and have some more realistic expectations of how school works, where they are coming to. So I just want to highlight on the bottom of this screen that there's a welcome to school pack, which is a really nice pack that you might want to use. It's aimed for children recently arrived in England to explain some of the processes in attending school. And it's useful to consider in advance of them arriving to think about how this information fits with your own school processes, and obviously then you can adapt the pack as necessary so that it's appropriate, and that it can be shared with the young person. It is available in different languages, really importantly. So I guess it's what's important also is to think with your communication, and I know schools can be really skilled in this, about being creative, using lots of visuals, storyboards, maps to help with communication, help make the information accessible. And I guess just the last thing to highlight here is this idea of doing a sensory walk around the school. So that might be something that you're really familiar with, that you might do with some particular students who you have, but actually really walking around the school as if you're an alien, you know nothing, and really notice, bearing in mind all of your senses that are now noises, the smells, the different things that are that are going on within your school. And then as you get to know a young person, you can be mindful, you can prepare them for the knowledge around certain things that happen and certain loud noises, or you can also just help them to make sense of what's going on when they're thrown into potentially an environment that feels very different from what they're used to. Again, I'll highlight, I'm talking generally, we know it will be very different for every child, how they will respond. So I wonder if you could just have a think now and put your ideas on Slido about what things you think you or your school could do to increase the safety for these students, that psychological safety, or perhaps a physical safety. It might be things that you already do, if you've already got students in school who are refugees. It might be things that you do for other students in the school that you feel will actually be helpful for these students too. And there may be a range of different things, and we really value people sharing their ideas, because everyone can learn from each other about what things might be helpful, what things have really made a difference in your school, for example, if these are things that you already do. So anyone that hasn't already had a go, it's really easy. All you do is log on to slido.com and you can see the code at the side of the screen there. Okay, buddy system. Yeah, we often hear just how important that is. And I guess if we think about that research that Kelsey talked about, that importance of peer relationships, creating an opportunity for a young person to offer some support rather than leaving a young person to fend for themselves or always rely on adults is really key. And that's actually can be great for that relationship. It can make the buddy feel good in that they're doing that, and creates that opportunity for connection and understanding and communication. And often kids can be great at communicating with each other without language. Okay, signage in their language for important locations. Yeah, that sounds really helpful. The use of interpretation services. Yeah, and I think we've got a particular translation tool that is seen to be far better than Google Translate, that's really helpful to have on hand. Easily access to contact person. So I guess it's one of those key people that I think is being talked about there, that a student can go to any time in school if they're struggling or need help. Okay, and a safe place, a safe space to meet other students with similar challenges. Yeah, and I guess we need to be really mindful of thinking of recognizing where that could be really helpful, but also recognizing where sometimes even if there's two refugees, they might not get on, or they might not have the same interests. So I'm sure that there is that in mind when you say that comment. I think those are really helpful ideas to think about what can make a difference in terms of increasing psychological safety. Let's just think a little bit more about belonging, which is that next sort of stage on Maslow's hierarchy, and that sense of belonging that, again, that research highlighted was really key. How do we build belonging? Through building connection and trust. And I guess you will all know relationships are the biggest predictor of overall happiness for all of us. And as humans, we're hardwired for connection. When we connect with others, it actually deactivates the stress response because it signals to the brain that we are safe. So connection, it really goes hand in hand with safety. And as we know that in order to start to feel psychologically safe, we must have established trust. And so relationships are really central to this. And we see schools as being such a great place for an opportunity to start create trusting relationships. And I guess we've just highlighted a few key aspects of what can help with this. Listening is an active act. When we truly listen, we're open and attentive only to what the other person is saying. So when we're listening, we're not actually thinking of what we want to say at the same time back. We're just hearing what's being said. I'm sure you all know times when you've had that experience of the other person's not really paying attention to you, and you're thinking, well, why am I even bother speaking? Maybe sometimes you find kids do that when you've got lots of things on your mind and that you're distracted. And I guess what's really important is that if we're actively listening and really hearing, that's actually tells the other person that they are important, that they're significant, that we want to pay attention to them. Giving eye contact with our body language. I can appreciate that can sometimes be tricky when you're also trying to use a translation tool, but in between the translation tool, try and reconnect through your body language. But active listening and not interrupting is really key. It can be really easy when we want to help people to want to problem solve very quickly when there seem to be issues. But actually what we know can be really helpful is just listening with warmth and empathy initially. Doesn't mean you don't try and help and think about how to address difficulties, but sometimes just talking about the problem in itself is what's needed for that person. You might have well experienced that as an adult, that sometimes it's quite irritating when somebody just quickly wants to solve the problem, and actually what you want to do is just get out the challenges in that conversation. So just listening can sometimes feel like just not really doing anything, but actually it's really important to hold in mind that that's not the case at all. Bearing witness to someone's experience, really hearing them and validating them and showing empathy, is an incredibly powerful act. That's a really important act just in itself. Now, coming alongside, we know is key. Being curious, maybe curious about differences that you're picking up with the particular students that you're with, but also without automatically challenging those differences. That can be a great way to start building up connection. Curiosity is such an important part of communication. It shows the other person that we're interested and wanting to understand and make sense of what their experience is. And that's really, really validating, knowing that somebody else is doing that about us. An important part of building connection and trust is also about navigating difficulties. And ruptures in relationships are normal, but they are stressful. So being able to model repairing a ruptured relationship is a really significant thing that you can be teaching and modeling to the students and those around you. When everyone's calm, you can start to talk about what the issues are in a relationship. So what we say is strike when the iron is cold, okay? So don't get into these discussions and try and address and repair when actually emotions are still high, but wait until everything's settled down and things are calmer for everyone. And then try and have conversations and perhaps use things like what we call I or I statements. So I feel this or we feel this is much blaming than saying you are or you seem. And so if we can help to teach students that relationships can be managed, and this is really key to helping maintain trust, which of course then is what makes a difference around belonging. And I guess I just want to say, be mindful that, you know, some children won't want to talk. They may not want to have discussions with you about anything that's gone on for them. Don't try and push them to talk if they're not ready. But I guess making sure that you show that you're available to talk if a young person wants to speak to you is really important. And remember that just those sort of warm, friendly, compassionate responses can be really key. So just thinking about belonging and what that might look like, schools can be a great place to proactively support belonging. We know that schools, for most people, is the best place for refugees to be, to help them to reintegrate into a new country and a new culture, and a great place to support post-traumatic growth. Some children will need more time before they're ready to engage in school, and we know that big school environments sometimes have to work harder to ensure that they are safe places for individuals. But things that you can do that will be helpful are around finding, you know, of course, things that you'll know, finding out what the student's interested in, looking for ways to incorporate those things into the school day if at all possible, ways to try and help your young person feel valued, opportunities for them to stay connected to the things that they're familiar with them. So whether it's objects that they have with them in school, a transitional object, or whether finding out about what things will help for them, ways to relax or calm themselves. So you can support them to think about what things they may need, what things will be helpful for them, and try and listen and understand for them. You can have ideas, but being led by them will be really key. Now, the research that Kelsey talked about highlighted how integration with peers is central to buffering the impact of trauma. And so I guess you'll need to be thinking about how you really support those relationships. You've already talked about buddy systems, seeing what clubs may be helpful, maybe trying to have more than one as a child gets a bit more settled into school, more than one link with other people. So there's others that can also to help support that young person navigate this sort of new world for them. I guess we'd just say be aware of unintentional stigmatization. I guess consider the balance of celebrating the differences that you might be aware of, which can feel very interesting for us, the differences in culture, but along with the risk of overly drawing attention to those differences. So just think, a child first coming into school is really most likely just to want to fit in. So maybe be mindful of highlighting some of those differences too soon. I guess what's really important is getting to know the individual child and being mindful of not making assumptions, but hearing from them what they would prefer about things. One thing I just want to highlight is being mindful of this power imbalance that Kelsey talked about earlier. One thing that's really key is that you can take, and we encourage the host to do the same, every opportunity to empower children and families. Doing for somebody can feel really nice for us, but actually it's very unhelpful for others because it fosters their dependence on us. And actually these families want to establish, whether it's shorter or longer term, an independent life here, and so they need to be enabled with the right support and scaffolding to be able to manage things, and that will be really important for their self-worth and how they feel about themselves. So they think, I can manage these things, and it's amazing what confidence that brings. So think about your role in enabling and supporting. Pitching in may be really important, but trying to take those small steps, and all the time always thinking about how can I pull back if they need my help now, when can I pull back? So there's never a plan of sticking stationary, but being involved a lot. So I guess what we know is that building that connection also with the families is really key. You can reduce parental anxiety and support communication by thinking about how you may communicate with the family. And High Translate is one that we've got in our resources at the end, which is meant to be much better, certainly in terms of Ukrainian language. It's free to download, much more reliable. Okay, so it's helpful to know about that. beware of safeguarding concerns. There are differences in different ways in which people manage things, and be observe and notice and discuss concerns, but recognise there are differences in ways people do things in different countries. I just want to say, beware of setting unrealistic expectations in terms of progress for these pupils, who will have so much to contend with what they have managed and adjustment, and knowing what you now know from Kelsey's part of the presentation about the impact of trauma on the brain. They may well not be in an emotional place to start things new. So recognise that this is less about their active academic learning perhaps at this stage. Not that you shouldn't be encouraging that, but try and be realistic about their expectations. There's so much learning about the system and life. And this picture's up here because I guess what we're saying is it's a marathon and not a sprint, this work. It takes time and patience and chipping away to try and build that connection, build trust, and foster a sense of belonging. I'm really aware of time and that we're moving along really quickly. So one thing you might want to go away and just think about is, how can you foster that sense of belonging more in school? So finally, just thinking a little bit about emotions and what you need to do if you need to do something more. Emotions are really important and they help us to make sense of things. So I hope all of you here recognise the value that we have all these emotions, but they can feel really hard. So on this slide is just some points about emotional containment. I think I've talked about some of these things already, giving space and validating emotions, encouraging creative opportunities to express emotions, and drawing on positive memories. So if a child is distressed in front of you, it might be helping them to recognise that some of the distress, if that's linked to their past experiences, is in the past, and then help them to focus on what are maybe some positive memories that they can hold on to. Grounding techniques, where you're trying to help a person bring them into the present moment and anchor themselves by using senses. There's a 5 senses is one technique you can Google and look up and see how you do that if you're not familiar with it already, but it's a good way of bringing a mind that's caught up with lots of past experiences back into the present moment. So it might be called a mindfulness or a grounding activity. And I guess if we can help to educate young people who are experiencing difficult emotions around what happens with emotional regulation, if they can understand how emotions raise but they will settle again, if they understand how the body works and the adrenaline shooting around the body, those will all be things that will help them to make sense of what's happening to them. So it might be education around emotions, around adrenaline, around anxiety, may be really helpful for these young people. So I just want to talk briefly about thinking about when and where to seek more help. So we've got a slide here with various different links that you'll be able to look at. And then shortly we're going to be going through some resources. So I'm sorry, we're just running slightly over. But I guess on this slide, it's just really important to highlight that it's normal for refugees to feel upset and struggling after frightening experiences, and we know that can look very different in different pupils. But where difficult experiences are ongoing and when there doesn't seem to be a resolution and distress is just continuing, that might be the time when that young person needs a little bit more support. Over time, most people become happier and more confident, but where there is more support needed and there is distress that continues, or a low mood, or you're hearing that the child hasn't sort of reverted more to their more day-to-day functioning, then that might be the time when you will want to seek more support. And so there will be people in your school who you might want to talk through things with, or the school nurse. There's also a refugee council and local community hubs all over Norfolk and Suffolk. There are very specific supports, and we've got links here that you can link in with. But hubs are often a really good place to start if you're feeling that people are distressed because they have got a lot of the key information. All refugees can register with a GP, so that's also another way to access support. And we've put some other links here at the bottom of the slide and for other ways of getting access. So lastly, I just want to remind you, as Kelsey said, about the importance of looking after your own well-being. We know the importance of connection. That's key for you too. Space is really key, isn't it? Time to down-regulate. Basic self-care. It can sometimes go when we're feeling overwhelmed with everything else. And when we're compassionate about supporting others, we can sometimes forget about ourselves. So remember the old adage, you know, you need to put your own oxygen mask on before you put somebody else's. And so really helping to look after yourself will help you to be in the best position to be able to support these young people that don't just need a short intervention, but they need your help and support little by little over maybe a longer period of time. So bear those things in mind. Make sure that you find time to do the things that are important and meaningful to you, and that will help you in your work, in your job role. And so just something for you to go away with and reflect. You may want to think about the students that you have in mind that we've been, as we've been doing this presentation, where are they actually sitting on this pyramid? And as you look at that pyramid, you may want to think, you know, what's realistic in terms of how we can move them up, and what is really the right sort of thing to be aiming for at this stage in terms of getting their needs met. So people will forget what you said and people will forget what you did. But people will never forget how you made them feel. And I guess the core of that is feeling safe and getting a sense of belonging. That's really such a key role for schools. So thank you for all of you for signing up and joining in this. Now we've got a whole range of resources, and I might just pass over to Kelsey to highlight just a few of the key ones, because I'm really sorry we are just over time. Thanks for those of you that are able to stay.
Thanks, Linda. Yeah, so just briefly, I'm not going to be able to talk through all the resources, but as we've said, you'll get the slides. But just some of the key ones, obviously the Say Hi Translate is the app that Linda talked about earlier, as well as you can see on there the kind of Welcome to School packs and the Welcome Pack templates for schools were the two resources that Linda referred to throughout the slides, and you'll see in the previous slides where they kind of fit and where they're most relevant. But the Association for Child and Adolescent Mental Health has some really nice podcasts which are really accessible, and if you have some time, I think particularly the first one talks to more of what Linda and I have already spoken about today. So just in terms of other resources, there's some emotion regulation strategies. I know we've kind of talked about where these might be useful for young people, and they're available kind of in different languages, as you can see on there as well. So just to come back to if you feel that would be useful for those young people. And I guess also just to say, although they're not specifically for refugee children and young people, some 5-minute videos by Karen Traceman, who's a clinical psychologist in the UK, might be also a useful introduction for yourselves around using some of these resources. There's also, sorry, I know we're rushing through this somewhat, but there's also some specific trauma resources as well that we touched on today, particularly the Beacon House one, but also other ones that are available in different languages, as you can see there, which might be nice to share if relevant. And also, as Linda sort of touched on, kind of gaining support from those your local kind of community support hubs. We know they're popping up all over kind of Norfolk and Suffolk. And as we've said, that kind of sense of belonging, that sense of community can be really helpful for all of us, but particularly these young people and families who have experienced trauma. And these were the ones that we were aware of. I think you can find more information kind of online and on social media, particularly Facebook, if you want to find out more about support groups in your area. But I guess really linking in with the Refugee Council, who will know more about them, would be the key piece of advice. Finally, we offer free parent carer workshops on a range of topics as well. They're regularly repeated. So if you follow us on Eventbrite, so Psychology in Schools team on Eventbrite, you'll be notified of those workshops. And also if you follow the NSFT YouTube channel, you'll see previous recordings on there, some of which are for school staff as well. So I guess that leaves us with our final two Slidos, and apologies again for slightly overrunning, but it'd be good just to hear from those of you that are still with us, whether you found the session helpful. So this is just a multiple choice Slido. It's really useful for us as we kind of continue to offer similar workshops to get a sense of whether it was useful. And please be honest as well. Brilliant. So I can see there's a few have already sort of indicating that you have found it helpful. Some people strongly agreeing, others agreeing, which is fantastic to hear. And I'll just move on, just in the interest in time, just to get you to think about what two key things you'll take away from this session. I guess it's again useful for us to know what was most kind of relevant, but also we know that writing things down can help, help us to keep hold of them and to put them into practice perhaps as well. So what two key things are there for you from today? And apologies, we didn't spend loads and loads of time on them, but as we said, you'll be getting the slides which will have the links in them to find out a bit more. Supporting the student to become more independent and how this would support them on a long-term basis. Lovely. It's kind of giving you maybe some ideas, maybe thought-provoking to think more about that and how you kind of maybe help students to move up that pyramid we've spoken about. Okay. So I'll wrap up just as the last kind of two people are typing, but just to say, thank you again for taking the time to attend the workshop. We know it's a busy time kind of coming back to school after the summer holidays, and we really hope you found it useful in kind of, thinking about some of these initial ideas and how you can support these refugee students. And as we've said, please follow us on Eventbrite to kind of find out some more information about the workshops and other things we offer. Just see a couple of other comments there about available contact person and using the resources, particularly helpful. Info on the hubs as well, so maybe it's something that you perhaps weren't aware of before, and consolidating knowledge on trauma, so useful recap and reminder maybe for some, and ideas on how to integrate students, and really that kind of fostering that sense of belonging. Lovely. Well, thank you all so much, and thank you for being so forthcoming on the Slido as well. That it was really, really helpful. So yes, thank you ever so much and take care.
Bye-bye.